at Dakota County Library, which is a county library system just directly south of the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And prior to accepting the position in 2016, I spent nearly 10 years in Illinois public libraries, and much of that experience was focused on accessibility and inclusion, working with individuals with disabilities to welcome them to the library. And that's what we're going to talk about today. What does accessibility mean? What are the implications and outcomes for your library in improving accessibility to your patrons? And what opportunities do you all have as public library trustees to ensure this is being addressed at your organization? So let's get started. It's always important for us to begin by talking about the why. Without a clear understanding about why we're doing things in our libraries and our organizations, it's difficult in the role of a trustee to be able to communicate and advocate for that to the community. But I'm here today to tell you that accessibility is not optional. And it's not just the nice thing to do. We'll talk about it. It is a legal requirement, but it also is for the betterment of your community. Public libraries exist to serve our communities, and access is a fundamental core value in our libraries in everything we do, from physical spaces to hiring practices to collections. And you all as library trustees are the most effective advocates for libraries. So today we're going to give you some tools to be able to do your jobs effectively to make sure that access really is provided to everyone. And I truly believe a stronger community is developed when everyone can take part. And it is or should be the mission of every library to work towards making their library as accessible and welcoming to every customer. So while your role is as a library trustee is a big picture role focused on governance, it really matters what those values are and how they play out in your organization. And when it comes to access, providing access also prevents costly litigation, which we will talk about as well. Public libraries are funded by and exist to serve their diverse communities, and I really mean that word diversity in a broad sense. Diversity in race, culture, gender, language, age, and ability. And our library communities are diversifying rapidly, so we need to make sure that the services our organizations provide, the spaces we build, the programs we plan are relevant and informed by those diverse communities. I think libraries are uniquely positioned to be models of inclusion in their communities because we are institutions for all. That's at the core of our values and our mission. So this aspect of equity and inclusion is incredibly crucial to our work. So if equity plays any role in the value at your organization, and I very much hope it does, accessibility to people with disabilities really needs to be a part of that conversation. So if we consider libraries as vehicles for community transformation and change, we also need to evaluate how our libraries are serving all of our patrons, including people with disabilities. It doesn't matter if your organization is big or small, a system or a standalone, or if your library is in an urban, suburban, or rural setting, all of our libraries serve people with disabilities. In fact, the number of people with disabilities is growing by leaps and bounds in a variety of in all of our communities. And a lot of that is due to the aging population, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But some of that growth is due to more sophisticated diagnostic tools regarding disabilities, as well as people who are more confident and willing to self-identify as having a disability. The 2010 U.S. Census data finds that 21% of the workforce has some sort of disability. So 1 out of 5 people. I think that has some strong implications for how we look at our communities and who visits our libraries. Also, according to the U.S. data, people with disabilities consist of the nation's largest minority group. And that might not be something that we necessarily think of when we think of the phrase minority group. We may think of that term in terms of racial or cultural or ethnic backgrounds, but actually people with disabilities make up the largest group of minorities in this country. 1 out of 4 in the U.S. have some sort of disability, and according to children, 1 in 20 children have a disability. So as we really think about the implications for our communities, how many people come to our library programs, who is downloading our ebook and our digital collections, we really need to consider the broad ability scope of our communities. In fact, the American Community Survey, the ACS, estimates that the overall rate of people with disabilities in the U.S. population in 2016 was 12.8. So again, some pretty significant data. But as we look at employment data of people with disabilities, we realize that it's not as equitable. In 2016, 35.9% of people with disabilities 18 to 64 were employed. Compare that with more than double of people without disabilities. 76.6% of people without disabilities were employed. So as we consider, the makeup of our staff, our organization, even as we think about who are our library trustees and who has the role to be the voice of our communities, do we have that representation in our communities, on our staff, in our organization, so that we can make sure that the voice of people with disabilities are being heard and that people are contributing? And remember, not every disability is visible, so we can't always tell if someone has a disability. Learning disabilities, autism spectrum disorder, dementia, these are just 3 examples of invisible disabilities. And people with disabilities make up the most vulnerable group, or one of the many vulnerable groups of people that are at risk in our communities. So how can we be serving them? I'm sure your communities, like mine here in Dakota County, are talking about the growing population of older adults. And more older adults want to age in place and desire to live independently in their own homes and communities. And so the growth in the aging population, the increase in life expectancy, and then also the increase of diversity and ability are all factors in your library's ability to serve your community effectively. And I'm noticing, certainly in Dakota County and Minnesota, that as our population ages, services and programs for older adults, we're needing to respond and evolve our services, because that means that the quality of life of people will be enhanced throughout their life. So as we think about an aging population, how can they benefit from our library? Because they will benefit and demand accessible buildings and services as they age in place in your community. So things that we'll talk about: low vision, low hearing, limited mobility, limited cognition, issues that people with disabilities have and encounter will also become issues for our aging residents as well. So let's get into brass tacks of accessibility, starting with 3 terms that you may have already heard of, but that you will definitely need to know. The Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law as the legacy of late President George H.W. Bush. And this is considered the most important civil rights law since Title 504. And the Americans with Disabilities Act is a federal law. It passed in 1990, and it ensures people are not discriminated against because they have a disability. 2 parts of the law apply particularly to public libraries. Title I requires equal employment opportunities for individuals with disabilities, and Title II prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in state and local government services, and that includes the public library buildings and services. The law provides that all people, including those who have disabilities, have essentially the same rights and access to public buildings and services as those without. And as we'll talk about, it definitely mandates certain building characteristics and design characteristics to make sure and ensure that people with disabilities can have access. And just so that you know, these building specifications are called the ADA Accessibility Guidelines and the UFAS, the Universal Federal Accessibility Standards. So those are 2 things that your library director and you as library trustees may want to look into. As I mentioned, ADA standards establish design requirements for construction and alteration of facilities subject to the law, and the accessibility guidelines also help with developing and updating these guidelines. I just want to mention at the end of my presentation, I will also have some further resources for all of you as you're interested in looking into and researching these topics further. So just a snapshot of some recent disability history. As I mentioned, 1990 is when the Americans with Disabilities Act became into law. But even within the last 30 to 40 years, we've seen significant improvement and enhancement to providing access to people with disabilities across the scope of access in public libraries. So certainly related to technology, as early as 1988, the Technology-Related Assistance for Individuals with Disabilities Act was passed. And then we're looking at 1999, the Unnecessary Institutionalization Rule discriminatory. And what does that mean what is the implication for that law, for example, for public libraries and library trustees? Well, that means that people with disabilities are more integrated and included in our broader community. So that means that people with disabilities are no longer in institutions and therefore afforded the ability to participate in community life much, much more often. So this is maybe perhaps one of the reasons since this law was passed that we are seeing a very much increase of people with disabilities using our libraries. So while ADA is to me really about compliance and accommodation for accessibility for people with disabilities, accessibility goes beyond compliance. And you know, people tend to think that the benefit of modifications is just for people who use wheelchairs or walkers or perhaps use leg braces or crutches. But the reality is that accessibility really makes life easier for everybody. It's a process of ensuring barrier-free access to products, services, excuse the typo, devices, or information to individuals with disabilities. Most people may have a disability, even temporarily, at one point in their life. They may break their arm. They may also become blind or not permanently blind. They may use crutches because they had a hip replacement or had a surgery from a sports injury. And even parents who arrive to the library with a child in a stroller, I know that they appreciate the ability to walk right into the library without having to squeeze through aisles and around tables and be able just to push a button to be able to open the door. ADA does not require accessibility in terms of that button, that technology that allows for automatic doors. That's an example of accessibility. So healthy, active seniors appreciate not having to struggle and lift those heavy doors, or they have safety bars in the bathroom. Again, all of these are examples of accessibility. So as we look at beyond accessibility, another definition that I think from a library trustee standpoint is important to note, universal design. And when I say design, we mean design in a broad sense, design of products and programs, spaces, and services. The Center for Excellence in Universal Design says that universal design is a process, not an outcome. It's not assumed or expected that a 100% universal solution will be achieved or is even achievable for every design, but rather universal design should be a goal that a designer strives to achieve. And how is this relevant for a library trustee? Well, a lot of our libraries now are undergoing remodel projects. I know in Dakota County Library, we just remodeled one of our library branches, are in the process of remodeling 2 additional branches right now. So as our buildings age and we solicit and elicit the help of architectural firms and designers, we need to make sure that they have our best and our community's best interests in mind, that they understand the concept of universal design, and it's more about function than just a pretty piece of furniture or a really nice snazzy feature on the wall, that everybody needs to be able to use our libraries to the greatest extent possible. So how can you advocate for accessibility? You may not, as library trustees, be empowered to dictate procedures, but trustee suggestions are valued and often acted upon by library administrators. Trustees help ensure that the library meets the needs of all users, and by meeting the needs of patrons with disability, this is a great way to build a relationship with your entire community. It's really a leadership opportunity that all of you have to help make impactful change in your communities. Where can you learn more about what your library is doing? Well, certainly with your relationship with your library director, that's going to be your number one. That's going to be your number one place to start. I know that I myself have presented at many an advisory and board meeting. So having staff present to you to talk about what the things that they are doing to help individuals with disabilities feel more welcome at their libraries, and of course, customer comments. But let's get into some real specific strategies as a library trustee board member for you as you are leading your organization. Accessibility goes beyond the building and really enters into every area of what the library offers. And I think at its core, accessibility needs to be embraced by every staff member and every board member to make sure that a library is truly welcoming and fulfilling its goal. It's really a key component of library culture, and being accessible and inclusive to is more than just an attitude. We actually have to act on this and make decisions that live out our values. But it also means addressing some deep systematic barriers and working with people with disabilities to make sure that those are addressed. So in order to create a culture and a community that really embraces accessibility, here are some things that you can do to get started. Well, make sure that you review your organization's mission, vision, and value statement, and make sure that these statements really include people with disabilities in the spirit and the goals of them. Your role as library trustees is to connect with your communities. And I wonder how many of us have, how many library trustees have talked to disabled patrons and talk to them about their library experiences. Their voice and their experience is just as valued as anyone else that we typically talk to who has used the library. And if they are not library users, that's a particularly important conversation to have with them too, asking them why they don't feel welcome at the library or why they have never thought to use the library before. I also think that talking to disability organizations in your community, perhaps there's a networking group in your community that brings together people serving individuals with disability, making sure that your library is represented at that group, or if topics of accessibility are discussed at library board meetings, this is something that you would advocate for as well. I think that all of trustees have an opportunity to bring forth those issues that are important to them. So advocating for community concerns about inclusion and accessibility with residents and sharing some of those conversations you've had with your residents will really help bring those experiences to light. Board-approved policies, this is one of your most important roles in reviewing existing library policies and making sure that there are no barriers to access, institutionally or otherwise. But also that our board-approved policies really need to make sure that they take an equity approach in this conversation. Not that everybody has equal opportunity, but that those that experience its institutional and systematic barriers for having a disability are able to actually equitably afford all of their access to the services. So as we think about policy, of course, reviewing and updating all out-of-date policies would definitely relate to your role. And I just highlighted a few policies that are particularly necessary to look at with regards to serving people with disabilities. Your patron code of conduct policy may relate to individuals with disabilities, or you may have a separate unattended child or vulnerable adult policy. These policies can inform and help staff identify opportunities for follow-up when it comes to appropriate behavior in the library, but making sure that the wording and making sure that this, the specific strategies and rules that you outline and dictate are not discriminatory or inaccessible to people with disabilities. Meeting room policy. Some libraries offer their meeting rooms for free. Other libraries decide to charge as an opportunity for revenue. Regardless of what your organization does, make sure that your meeting room policy is as accessible to people with disabilities as possible. Service animals are actually identified and outlined under ADA, and under current ADA law, dogs are the only service animals that are identified as quote-unquote service animals. Another phrase that you might hear are emotional assistance or therapy dogs. These are a separate class or a different type of animal that provides emotional support for individuals in utilizing the library. But they are both very different. So while service animal policies are helpful to identify for staff appropriate use of the library by those with service dogs, you may also want to address or have your library director address what to do when people with service animals come into the library. So having a very clear and effective service animal policy will help inform effective use of the library. And of course, not everything is, not all of our policies are about external use of the library, but also we need to reflect about, our internal policies on our hiring and employment opportunities at the library. So a good example of this is to make sure that staff know exactly how to request accessibility or an accommodation made for them as they are hired at their library if they themselves have a disability. A couple of other suggestions: researching other libraries' accessibility policies, and making sure that your strategic plan also ensures accessibility, that it's included in the vision in the next 2 or 3 or 5 years of your library's work. And because ultimately all of this work relates to potential litigation, you want to make sure that your library has effective legal representation and its insurance policy is up to date. And the other side of this coin is that library policy really does need flexibility. Staff should be empowered, for example, to extend loan periods to patrons with disability if needed, or allow patrons who need a small snack or a beverage if they have a medical need while they're in the library. We can really run into problems when we hold very fast to our policies. So making sure that our library directors and our staff are empowered to provide that flexibility to provide the best customer service. One last suggestion with regarding your policies: make sure that you are putting those policies on your website for everyone to view and access. In a recent Dakota County survey that we implemented here in Minnesota, we sent out a county-wide survey to really evaluate how individuals with disabilities are using their library. And we learned that the #1 place for people in the disability community to learn about our library was actually the library website. So make sure that you put up that information on your website. Now, we've talked about the ADA, and the ADA requires reasonable modifications to buildings, permitting buildings to remain unchanged if the modifications would be too costly, as long as the plan indicates that the problems are to be resolved if remodeling is undertaken or a new building is built. What that means to me is that it's the role of the board and the library director to ensure that the library building is not just compliant, but that it is accessible. And it's a responsibility that the board shares with the municipality, because as we think about our communities, curb cuts, parking stalls, signs, accessible entrances, automatic doors, these may be things, some of them are required by ADA, but as I mentioned, automatic door openers are not required by ADA. But this is definitely a worthwhile investment to make sure that everyone is accessible at your library. Even something as simple as door handles. The right type of door handle can really provide access, or could also be an opportunity for risk at your organization. So what are some things that your institution can do? As I've mentioned, your library director is going to be the leader in this area. So collaborate with them to develop an ADA or accessibility plan for your organization, and review and address indoor and outdoor features of your library space. Another thing that I may have mentioned is that we are in libraries often interviewing and working with different architecture and design firms. And it's not all architecture and design firms are made equally in the world of accessibility. Myself, having worked with several, that is not necessarily a topic that every architect knows and really lives out in their work. And I've often had to advocate for function and accessibility beyond design, knowing that in the end it was because it's because of community access and making sure everyone is accessing the library. So making sure you bring these up when you're interviewing these consultants. And I know that your municipality or your cities may have local initiatives or efforts identifying accessibility as a priority. So if this is the case, you know, reach out and make sure that the library is at the table in those conversations, because the library is a key partner in those conversations. And I would also say you could consider consulting services specializing in accessibility to provide assessment of library furniture, signage, and spaces. And this is something that we're actually doing at Dakota County Library here in Minnesota. We received a Department of Human Services grant when we went out for RFP, and we actually are working with 2 consulting firms to address accessibility, both in our communication, so our library website, our platforms, and our marketing materials, as well as our customer experience. So, you know, really thinking that maybe perhaps the library is not the expert in accessibility, so we need to partner with those who are to make sure that our communities and our library spaces are the most accessible as possible. There's a quote I often share during my presentations about accessibility, and that's, "Inclusion is not about the space, but it's about the spirit." And in a similar way, I think libraries are not about the building, but the service that's being provided within and outside of the building. So, you know, in some communities, getting to the library is not an option for folks with limited mobility, especially for those of us that might serve rural areas and public transportation is limited. But I would also say that customer service really is what libraries are all about, and people are at the heart of it. And if your library provides ineffective or discriminatory customer service to people with disabilities, your library could be at risk, not just for your reputation, but otherwise. It's been my experience the disability community is a very tight-knit community, and that really utilizes the power of network to talk about what places in the community are good to visit and which places are not. So knowing that people don't often share the good experiences they have, but if they have a bad experience, you can bet that they're going to share about that. So what are some of your opportunities for leading in the area of customer service at your organization? Make sure you work with your library director to ensure that suggestions and inquiries related to accessibility are given very swift responses and effective follow-up. You may not be able to act upon every single suggestion provided by your community. However, making sure that the voice is heard, that the voices are being heard, and actually reasons are provided in terms of follow-up and answers to the initial inquiry. It's also true that people with disabilities may need to submit special requests for accommodations, and your library director and organization should have an effective procedure or even policy about this. So, for example, if someone needs to request ASL interpretation or needs to ask for assistive hearing devices be on staff or available during the library program, how is that request made? How do staff get informed about this? Making sure that you have that procedure in place will help with this. And ultimately, customer service to me is about making sure that we as our organizations have authentic and relevant, informed feedback from people with disabilities in our communities. What is it that they're saying about our libraries? What is it that they use at our libraries? And what can library trustees do to gather that feedback? Maybe advisory groups or focus groups, or even working with library staff to launch an online community-wide survey like we did at Dakota County, and partnering with local disability groups to gather that feedback. Ultimately here, library trustees, you are your voice for your community, and making sure that every voice is heard and not just those who have access to the library, but making sure that people with disabilities are heard as well. Technology really is a tool in order to do something independently. You know, I think about even glasses. For those of us that might wear glasses or have contacts, this is an example of assistive technology, whether we think it right away or not. But individuals with disability more often than not require tools and technology to live independently. And the library has so many examples of technology and tools that can be accessible for everyone to use. And if they're not, the library may be at risk for a lawsuit. In fact, libraries have been the subject of lawsuits regarding technology and accessibility in the past. In recent years, the National Federation of the Blind filed suit against the Free Library of Philadelphia for its circulating Nook e-reader program because the devices were not ADA compliant. So it's important that we do our homework, not only to investigate accessibility when designing our web services, but also when we adopt new technology, because otherwise it could be a costly mistake. But to me, ultimately, it just means that we didn't really think about our end user at the forefront of that project. So again, looking at the role of the trustee, what is it that you can do? Work with your library director to ensure your library website is compliant with the Web Compliance Accessibility Guidelines. And the most recent one is the WCAG 2.1. And your technology director or department head could provide more information about how the library is not only compliant, but achieving accessibility within these guidelines. Does your library provide assistive technologies that are available, such as magnifiers, large print keyboards, and assisted learning systems, and assisted listening systems? I mean, we think about 3D printing and audio software and all of the new technology that are available to libraries. How are those maker technologies promoted and accessible to people with disabilities? You know, these are things that we need to ask ourselves. And another role that the library trustee plays is, you know, really adopting or signing on to new contract agreements or supporting the signing of new contract agreements with new digital platforms and software programs, and ensuring and asking questions that accessibility features are available at the onset instead of realizing after the fact that a new platform or technology is not accessible after you've already rolled it out to the public. Advocating for accessibility, usability testing on library websites, app platforms, software programs, and social media channels. We at Dakota County recently just had our social media team participate in a library training to learn how to make our social media channels more accessible to people with disabilities. And in the same way, we are working with, as I mentioned, a consulting firm to do some usability testing on our library website and our online experience to make sure we look for gaps in accessibility there too. A few other suggestions suggest that your library have a Section 504 or 508 coordinator, and these are people that are invested with authority to ensure compliance when purchasing electronic resources. So again, really trying to be proactive instead of reactive in the area of technology. From frontline staff to the director and board members, everyone should be equipped with customer service tools that serve patrons effectively and inclusively. According to EDGE, which is a subscription-based library and management benchmarking tool, library staff should be provided with training in the area of accessibility at least annually for recognizing and serving patrons with disability. So recognizing from a board member standpoint that staff training is incredibly essential and that you support this to make sure that the experience in the library is accessible for all. I really think that beyond accessible tech or beyond accessible spaces, an enlightened and engaged staff is the most powerful tool that we all can have in the world of accessibility. This will really make sure that your organization values and mission and vision are being lived out. So in working with your library director, making sure that library trustees advocate and support frequent and regular staff training, and this is something for all levels of the organization. Learning opportunities on accessible customer service, customer programs, inclusive customer programs, accessible social media and technology. I even think that employee onboard training that addresses accessibility at the forefront is something that every new staff member should have. A new staff member should walk into your organization and really get a sense of what the values of your organization are, and accessibility really should be at the forefront of that. And making sure we practice what we preach, that we offer in-person and online training opportunities in a variety of formats so everybody can participate in the way that their learning suits them best. And again, clear and effective procedures for staff requesting accommodations if they themselves are an individual with a difference or disability. One of the most important roles you have as a library trustee is reviewing and approving the director's proposed annual budget. And there's a reason I put this topic at the end of the presentation. It will cost money to make things more accessible and inclusive at your library, whether it's equipment, space, programming, staffing, or training. So what, if anything, is your library's value? Is your library's value accessibility, or these are some of the things that you're hoping to do in living out these values? Well, if that's the case, then you really want to make sure that your budget reflects your values. Because a budget is an expression of your organization's values. Ultimately, what you support financially and what you don't is what your organization says is worthy and important. And so as a public library trustee, you and your fellow board members are accountable to the organization and the community for the decisions that are made regarding budget. So it's important that the library, an example that I have a budget, is important that the library has even a discretionary budget for the purchase of special equipment that a particular patron might need, such as magnifying glasses or flashlights in the stacks, whatever it is that's needed. An example from a previous library, you may receive a request for ASL interpretation at your library for a program. That is a service that does cost money because American Sign Language interpretation is a much needed and valued topic. So it does cost money. Does your library have a discretionary budget to fund those opportunities when those opportunities come up? Or is your budget reflected, does your budget end up having to be more limited in having your library director really be available to support that type of opportunity, to support the community? So making sure that your annual budget addresses physical space, online spaces, website and technology, as I mentioned, perhaps consulting services, not legislation, but legal representation, programming and services. Because what disability-related programs and services lack in numbers, they definitely make up for in impact. And to me, that's just an expression of equity. People with disabilities don't have the same opportunities as people without disabilities, and therefore, maybe our numbers do not exactly reflect the same type of participation, whether they're in programs or circulation, as our numbers do for people without disabilities. But the fact that we're even offering programs and services for people with disabilities, that helps increase not only our reputation, but it really does help our organization live out our values. So by the fact that you came to today's webinar today, I know that you value the topic of accessibility at your organization. So even if you do just one thing, I hope it's this. Consider it my call to action to you. I encourage that all of you go back to your library and at your next board meeting, talk about this training, talk about what you learned, talk about some of the questions you have, share this PowerPoint, and also consider sharing these questions. These are a couple of questions that I developed for you as a discussion at an upcoming library board meeting or board retreat discussing accessibility. Learn what experiences and knowledge your fellow trustees have on this topic, and also share your own. I think as you navigate these discussions, you'll learn something new and definitely think about accessibility in your organization in a completely different way. And as a librarian, I have to send you off with some further reading and research. So a few things to highlight. The second title, the Title II Technical Assistance, connects you with the manual that addresses how state and local governments, including libraries, can comply with the ADA. And if you're interested in learning more about the universal design principles, I've included a resource here that goes in more in-depthly and connects you with the US Census as well. So I do have time for questions at the end, I believe a little bit, right, Joe? But in the meantime, I just want to say thank you. And you're more than welcome to please contact me if there are any questions about this topic or anything else regarding accessibility, because that's really how our communities are really impactful.
Great. Thank you so much, Renee. So we'll give Renee here 30 seconds to catch her breath after giving us a lot of great information the last 40 minutes. Just a couple notes. I do want to mention for those of you, and we do have a combination today of trustees, but also administrators that have joined us for today's webinar. You can find a number of past webinars on the Rails CE Archives page that address accessibility in some way. So I encourage you to take a look at that, including actually one that Renee, along with Holly Jin from the Skokie Public Library, did around, I believe the title was Accessible to All, Serving Youth and Young Adults with Disabilities. So again, if you're looking for more information and to dig into this topic a little more, there are some resources in addition to what Renee has given us, but also some other webinars that you can find through Rails website. So Renee, we do have 2 or 3 questions here for starters, so let me just read these out. So one trustee has mentioned that she feels that I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here, feels that the library in terms of accessibility does pretty well from a standpoint of building and policies, but has done little to nothing in terms of programming. So wondering if you have any suggestions, any examples of really effective programming that you've seen or maybe been involved with.
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing I like to say is that any programming or services that are developed at a library really should be informed by the community. So there are many examples of libraries that are doing really effective programs for individuals with disabilities or effective strategies for including people with disabilities in existing programs, because there really are those two philosophies, a more targeted approach or a more inclusive approach. But that I think that really starting from a point of getting feedback and reaching out to the disability community first to figure out what is needed or what is desired. So is there a lack of recreational opportunities for individuals who are in that young adult age range? That can be a difficult age range to think about for adults and parents who are of children with disabilities. These are young adults who are just about to embark upon living independent lives, but they may no longer have the services that they once did in providing them or affording them opportunity. Is the library suited to provide life skills training, like creating resumes or doing interviews or even just learning how to use Microsoft Word? I mean, we think about some of the existing programs and services we already do when it comes to technology or life skills. These are things that can be promoted to the disability community and just to let people know what we have to offer. One of the most impactful pieces of advice I got after a survey focus group was that a disability organization said they didn't even need anything new or special. They just wanted to know more about what the library was already doing because they had no idea, and they could see the alignment and the synergy with some of our existing services with their groups and their population. But of course, there are other examples. I would say some really wonderful models in Illinois. Skokie Public Library as well as Deerfield Public Library are some fantastic libraries that do programming and services for all ages with disabilities. So I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you, Renee. A couple other questions here, and I think you addressed this a little bit on your last slide, but a library that really doesn't feel like they've done anything around accessibility, wondering where you recommend starting, and maybe even kind of after having that conversation at a board meeting, if you feel like, if a library feels like it's done nothing, do you think it's starting with looking at policies, the facility, doing that poll of your community? Where would you recommend as a place to start if you haven't really done anything?
Right. I think from a trustee standpoint, I think their role really, your role is to inform policy and building, but that cannot be informed without community involvement and relationship building. You really need both sides of the coin here. So working with the library director to make sure that the library is reaching out to existing patrons with disabilities that use your library, because that's a really good place to start. Even just having an authentic conversation and saying, we may not always have been accessible, and we realize that. We really do need your help to help inform future work in this area, and what can we do differently to make sure that you are welcome and everybody with disabilities is welcome. I think it could be just as easy as a conversation. So from a library trustee standpoint, going out in the community and meeting those individuals and asking them directly. Sometimes I see libraries running into a little bit of challenges when they develop this new program or new service and it's not informed by the community. They don't know if it actually is reaching or serving a purpose, and then nobody comes or nobody takes part of it. To me, that's, while the effort was admirable, I think that to me reflects the fact that those relationships, those key relationships, were not built in the beginning. Partnerships can help you with marketing. Partnerships can help you serve the community that you're hoping to target, maybe users that have never visited your library. So that's why I always advocate for relationship building and just talking to the community first in a more concerted way as a survey, or even something small like community conversations.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you know how often it's recommended that a library has an ADA facility assessment done by an ADA consultant?
That is a really good question. I'm writing it down because I don't know the answer to that question. A lot of the research I did for this training specifically said having that plan updated and reviewed regularly. I'd have to dive into the actual legislation to see if there's a specific amount of years that it's required to have that updated. But I don't know, but I'd be glad to look into that. At the very least, I think the library's attorney would be able to answer that question as well.
Right. And I know, and this is a question coming from me, Renee, but I know you had mentioned early on about networking groups, and I was wondering if you could just say a couple words about snails, because I think that for trustees that are maybe encouraging their director and director by extension staff, that we know that networking groups have often play an important role in our library community. And I know that Snails is one that you were very involved with, and I think continues to meet and do things. So could you just say a few words about that group?
I'd be glad to, Joe. Thanks. So SNAILS stands for, it's an acronym that stands for Special Needs and Inclusive Library Services. It's a networking group that launched, several years ago by my friend and colleague, Holly Jin, at the Skokie Public Library, out of a need to serve librarians and library staff who were asking Holly and I questions about serving people with disabilities with programs and services. And we saw a need and kind of a gap in knowledge on this topic. So we saw a need to bring librarians together to share best practices, to talk about what's working, what's not, and ultimately support each other in our journey of accessibility. And so this networking group meets 4 times a year. As far as I know, they still do. They also have an online virtual space, the Snails Library blog, where people share resources and share examples of things that they've done at their library. It regularly meets around the Chicagoland area, but I know there have been opportunities for Snails members to present at library conferences through ILA and more down south. And so this is, to me, I think a great example of kind of a grassroots initiative to help and try and make our libraries more accessible. We saw a need and we brought each other together to learn more. And a key component of that meeting is often bringing someone in outside of libraries who has the knowledge and the expertise in accessibility. Maybe they work with people who are blind, or maybe they work with people who are hard of hearing. Maybe they're a speech pathologist and they work with individuals with reading disabilities. We try to partner with local organizations and people to help give us information that we may not have learned in library school, but that could help inform the development of programs and services in the realm of libraries. So I know it's still going on. I would say check it out. The Snails Library blog, and Holly Jin is still coordinator of that wonderful, wonderful group who I miss so very much. But thankfully, we have something akin to Snails here in the metro area in the Twin Cities, where we work with our metro consortium of libraries to bring that knowledge together and to share best practices. So I think it's really powerful for those libraries that have never done anything before. Get in touch with Holly, get in touch with Snails to learn what other libraries are doing and see what's already working for them.
Great. Okay, well, that looks like all the questions have been answered from our participants. So first I want to thank everyone who has tuned in for today's webinar. As I said, in the next couple of days, you'll get an email from me with a link to the recording and a copy of the slides and the handout that Renee is providing. Obviously, that recording for any trustees that couldn't be with us today, or any staff that you also would be interested in sharing this with, that will be available to you. And again, Renee, thank you for a lot of great content today, and appreciate you doing this webinar for us. Good to have you back in Illinois here for this last hour. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks everybody for attending.
Okay, have a good rest of your week, everyone. Bye now.
Bye-bye.